What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic DFS channel. And today we're talking college football DFS ahead of week 2, the Saturday main slate. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you by Caesars Sportsbook. New users, when you bet $50, you are going to get $250 free in the form of bonus bets. $50 right after that first wager settles. Then you'll get $50 each of the next 4 weeks. Maybe take one of the games from betting you, whatever you want to do. But very good offer. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, please call or text 1-800-GAMBLER. All right, I'm going to bring you guys behind the glass with our data usage tool. This is available on the site. If you want player projections, ownership, this data tool, head over to Stochastic or use the link in the video description below. I think it is a phenomenal way to get acquainted with the slate. And if you're watching this video for the first time, just to kind of run you through this briefly, up at the top, you're going to see matchup data. Seconds per play is generally a ranking, how fast these teams play, your pass rate. That's pretty self-explanatory, just how often you're throwing. OL, DL. OL is sacks allowed, DL is sacks generated. That's an average per game, so we only have the 1 game sample. You've got your Vegas data, so Notre Dame is a 7.5-point favorite over NC State. The total is 50.5 points. That gives you the implied team totals. Passes, how many yards they're allowing per game, yards per attempt. That's how many they're allowing per attempt through the air, and then the same thing goes for run defense. As far as the stats go, I think these are pretty self-explanatory. For quarterbacks, it's just attempts per game, yards, rushing yards, broken down per carry, and then you can see sacks and scrambles. The only other thing I added this year is down at receivers where you have route percentage. That's just every time there's a route run, how often is that player on the field? Otherwise, if you have questions, let me know in the comment section and I'll try to explain this for you further. But let's dive into the slate and we'll start with this first game. Already talked about the Vegas data. So we've got Notre Dame favored here. First time they'll be tested this year after playing Navy and East Tennessee State. The big thing with the slate this week is we have quarterbacks all priced up. And we have good ones, but they all have questions. Like with Hartman, he hasn't played anyone good yet. How does he look in this new offense, which has been lackluster at receiver? Brennan Armstrong looked terrible in week 1. He's priced up at 9,200. How does he look? And then the rest of the way, you've got like Shedeur Sanders priced way up. He's got 1 game under his belt. How does this continue for him? So the theme is we have really expensive quarterbacks, and we don't have a proven guy like Caleb Williams, Drake May, Penix. None of them are on the slate. So I think you can go down in price, and I think 4 running back lineups are live this week. Not in like 100% of lineups, but more so than really they have been at points this year. Back to Hartman and Notre Dame. They're a run-heavy team. They're a pretty slow team. Hartman has not been used in the run game whatsoever. He's done it before at Wake Forest. He did plenty, but he only has 1 design rush attempt so far this year. I think that mainly is a function of who they've played. Actually, like Hartman as a GPP play, especially if Notre Dame elevates that pass rate. They're going to be tested a little bit more, but say this plays closer than the spread. Hartman's been a guy we've backed plenty of times in the past in that Wake Forest offense, and I'm willing to stack him here. If you look at the receivers, none of them are going to be owned. I think the route shares are interesting to look at. They've been in just pure blowouts, so I think the routes are going to rise for Jaden Thomas, Tobias Merriweather, and then I think Jaden Greathouse is going to end up playing a decent amount over Chris Tyree down the stretch here. Greathouse just their 4-star freshman. He's a little bit better when he's on the field. As you can see, he's the second leading receiver so far this year with 98 yards, which trails only Jaden Thomas. As far as tight end goes, I am interested in Mitchell Evans. He's 4,100. Notre Dame has been essentially feeding the tight end position targets going all the way back to, like Michael Mayer and Cole Kmet before that. So this is somewhat interesting to me price tag wise, but I think this is a pretty good GPP team. We're going to see some heavy chalk this week, and that always is concerning to me after we have a 1 game sample. So I'll take some shots on the Notre Dame pass catchers. Audric Estime, I think, is a great play. I think he's going to be decently owned, but not particularly heavy. He has 31 touches over the last 2 games. NC State gave up 6.2 yards per carry to UConn last week. A lot of that came on 1 carry from Victor Rosa, but still, that's not a positive sign. Estime is a good pass catcher too, so that's something I think we can look at here. I don't really have much interest in the backs behind him. I think they likely see their work decrease in more competitive games. For NC State, Brennan Armstrong projects decent here. I mean, I was really disappointed with him in week 1. The guy took off and scrambled 10 times. which is fine. I mean, it's great for your floor in DFS, but 9 design rushing attempts that put him at 19 total carries for 96 yards on the ground. I mean, what Brennan Armstrong needs to throw the ball more if he's going to pay off this 9,200 price tag. He either needs a 100-yard bonus on the ground or a 300 through the air. Otherwise, 9,200 is too expensive for him. But for tournaments, I think we could look at him. Stacks are going to be live. We can go back to 2021 with Virginia when they passed a ton under Robert Anae, who he's reunited with. The only receiver that played really the whole game was Kevin Conception, Casey Conception. Sometimes he's listed as 84% of the routes for Conception. Behind him, it was Keon Lassane at 68%. Pretty lackluster. Otherwise, I mean, Porter Rooks, 59%. Julian Gray, 49%. Bradley Rosner, really disappointing at 35%. This is not new for NC State. They have a new OC, but they've been doing this rotation for a while now. I think you look at Conception and you probably move on. I don't have a ton of interest in the tight ends like Penix either. The backfield I do think is somewhat interesting. Like we predicted last week, Jordan Houston, terrible again. Very inefficient runner. Michael Allen, hyper efficient when he actually gets the ball. And this week, they listed them as co-starters. So finally, NC State making the right move. Put Michael Allen in over Jordan Houston. For the purposes of DFS, neither of them are playable here. So to sum this up, like the Notre Dame passing attack for GPPs, is Steve May fine across contest. Brennan Armstrong is risky at this price. I think he might come in a little over-owned, but if you want to stack up the game, no real issues with it. Second game we have is James Madison, Virginia. For purposes of just the sheet in general, you're going to see dashes if they haven't played an FBS team yet. So James Madison beat up an FCS school. Virginia lost to Tennessee last week. Now you have James Madison as nearly a touchdown favorite, 6.5 over Virginia, somewhat surprisingly, 40.5 total. So right away, you're not focusing much attention on this game. I do think Jordan McLeod is interesting for GPPs. The guy has some mobility. He's 5K, and there aren't very many cheap quarterbacks. So I'm not sure if I'm going to play him yet, but I'm not Xing him out of my player pool. They used a rotation last week, and Alonzo Barrett played terribly. This week, they came out and just named McLeod the starter. They might rotate, but I think there's a good chance he sees the whole game. Backfield was a two-way committee, Keon Black and Latrell Palmer. They used Palmer a little bit more in the pass game. Keon Black does a 36% route share. So I think this is likely going to be a 50-50 committee. I'm not really too interested in either back here. If I were taking a shot, it would be on Black. I think in more competitive games, there's the chance they give him a better workload. I mean, last week wasn't competitive, and Black was hyper efficient. So if you were, of course, there's going to be volatility in projections in week 2. We just don't have a ton of data. I think for those of you guessing out there where projections could be wrong, this is one spot. You have a pretty good matchup. Virginia allowed 5.5 yards per carry to Tennessee last week. We have a touchdown favorite. I would look to Keon Black here for tournaments. I think 4,200 is a good play, and I don't think he's going to be particularly owned. Pass game is dicey. I think Reggie Brown is viable at 4,500, 80% of the routes. Zach Horton, 72%, and Phoenix Sproles, he was their wide receiver 3, 76%. I just don't anticipate this team being very pass heavy, and it doesn't look like this is the game where you're going to see a lot of these guys out there running a bunch of routes, catching a bunch of passes. It's not a tightly priced slate, so I don't think you need to get them. These are just pure GPP guys. Virginia, they lost Tony Muskett. Allegedly, he's questionable here. I don't know that he is. He has a shoulder injury. We'll see. I mean, I don't have interest in Muskett either way. I don't have much interest in Anthony Colandrea, who's their freshman. The one thing I'll say about Colandrea is he is somewhat mobile. So you want to throw like a complete dart. I mean, we were just talking about McLeod as a dart based on his rushing. Colandrea could be somewhat mobile here. In the biggest of tournaments, I don't hate it. Running back is a complete mess. I don't think you play any of these guys. None of them are priced at a position where I think they're even viable. Pace would be the guy like most at 3,100, but I'll pass. Receiver, you might get some really cheap targets here, but the problem is none of these guys are below 4K. So, I mean, like Malachi Fields, Malik Washington. How many yards are you really going to get from this team week in, week out? Not many. And your route share, 83% for the pair of them. It's good, but again, I'd love these guys below 4K. Not a game I want much exposure to. Purdue, Virginia Tech, 3-point spread in favor of Tech, 48 total. This went down. Now it's coming back up. Purdue's playing fast and they're playing pass heavy. And that's somewhat surprising. They lose Brom, but of course, Graham Harrell's their new OC. So I guess not that surprising. Hudson Card's the quarterback. Again, they're going to play fast and pass heavy. This team is 24th in seconds per play last week. Card was pretty decent, 254 yards, rush for 29. He does have sneaky mobility. He's my favorite cheap quarterback. I'm talking like 6.5K or lower. Card is my favorite. I don't anticipate him being very owned. So you could play Card. I think you can stack him. And I like this stack a lot. All their receivers are really cheap. Deion Burks at 4,800. This is an egregious price tag for a receiver who's playing for a pass-heavy team and a fast team. He's going to be extremely owned. So we had some feedback last week talking more about ownership. Burks might be your most owned receiver. He's going to be in your top 5. Navigate that carefully. You did have Abdur-Rahman Yassin at 94% of the routes and TJ Sheffield at 85%. You also had tight end Max Clare at 33. They've got some injuries in the tight end room, so this is going to be a late news situation, but I don't think they're going to get their guys back. You can look to Max Clare at 3,300 if you just need a near stone minimum punt. And these guys will also all offer leverage off Burks, who's going to be the most owned receiver in this room by far, and he deserves it. He's explosive. Devin Mockabee is a pretty decent running back pivot at 6,300. I don't anticipate him being very owned. Virginia Tech, they did give up 5.4 yards per carry last week to Old Dominion, which is pretty egregious. So, yeah, I think you can use these guys. Now, as far as anyone else in the run game, I'm probably staying away. It's Mockabee or it's pass, honestly. For Virginia Tech, this is a very difficult team for me to analyze this week. They were terrible last year. They played a horrible team in week 1 in Old Dominion. They still allowed 5.4 yards per carry to that Old Dominion team. Now their secondary stood up, but Old Dominion is playing an FCS quarterback as their starter. What do we make of Virginia Tech? I do think they added some guys like Bayshul Tootin. He played horribly in week 1. He had 22 touches, only 55 rushing yards. I mean, I think Purdue is a better run defense than Old Dominion, but I mean, that volume is very nice. You still only saw 47.5% of the carries. Like Malachi Thomas was involved. Say Purdue gets up in this game and you still have this split. That's where Bayshul Tootin and Malachi Thomas get in trouble if this doesn't play to the spread. And it's only 3 points. So I think they are contrarian. I'm worried about the offensive line. I'm worried about the efficiency for this team running. And I'm worried about this split when Virginia Tech goes down in games. I'm also worried about Grant Wells at 7,400. This price tag is almost a complete joke. I would rather play Hudson Card every single day of the week. Grant Wells is not deserving of this price tag. He should be 5.7K or 6K. The receiving core is interesting here. With Old Dominion on the slate week 1, I would guess that the starting 3 receivers get more routes. That's Allie Jennings, Jalen Lane, and Daquan Felton. Again, none of them even hit 70% of the routes. And Jennings in particular was concerning at 55%. He split time, but I think they do consolidate this and get rid of Steven Gosnell other than just like pure rotational snaps when games are competitive. So maybe some sneakiness here, but they didn't price Jennings down. They didn't price Lane down or Felton down. So Virginia Tech's kind of a pass. Maybe I'll sprinkle them for tournaments. Troy, Kansas State. Both these teams played FCS schools week 1, so we don't have a ton of data and pace and stuff. What we can fall back on is neither of these teams project to be pretty fast. We have continuity in the coaching staff. And I don't think either of them project to be particularly pass heavy. Troy will definitely pass a little more than Kansas State, especially because they're 17-point underdogs. The game total is 51.5 points. Both these teams play pretty good defense. Kansas State did lose a couple NFL guys, an edge rusher, a couple corners. So that is a concern, but ultimately they're facing a Sun Belt team here. I did bet Troy, but for DFS, Gunnar Watson's typically not very interesting to me. He has a negative career rushing yards. I don't have the figure in front of me, but it's not positive. The guy takes a lot of sacks and he can't run. So for college, that's always dicey unless he's playing in the Sun Belt, a Sun Belt opponent, or the game total is really high or something. It's not here. So I'm not on Watson. Kamani Vidal is interesting as a tournament play. He had 26 touches, 60% of the touches on this team last week, and he was hyper efficient. So that makes sense. I mean, they played an FCS school. He was going to be hyper efficient, but even if they're getting crushed in this game, Vidal is a really good workload. He had a 57% route share. That's really good. You can play him in tournaments. He's not going to be owned because Their team total is low, and they're 17-point underdogs. Receiving game, they rotated a ton. I do think this is a Virginia Tech situation where Jabre Barber, and I mean, he's going to be their one, I think. But Deshaun Stoudemire, I do think these guys see their routes condense in more competitive games. Those would be the 1-2. I think you could throw darts here. They're not expensive, but I don't want to stack them. Chris Lewis, I think, is the 3. Will Howard projects decently well here. He's more mobile than the 5 yards indicate. I think that's just they didn't use him at all on designed runs, really. He only had 2 because they played an FCS team, only scrambled once. They just weren't a non-competitive game, so they didn't need to use his full skill set. And he still passed for 285 yards. So Will Howard, I think, is live for tournaments. I have a little less interest in him than guys like Hartman and Armstrong, just because I think the ceiling for them is a little more clear. The backfield's a committee. They're using DJ Giddens slightly ahead of Trayshawn Ward. There's not a lot separating them in the run game or the pass game. I think they're fine for tournaments as pretty big favorites. So this is a mix and match situation. Compare like a sort of a poor man's Penn State or Ohio State. You know how they used Henderson and Williams and then Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. This reminds me of that. Giddens is cheaper and he'll play more. So I think Giddens would be the guy you go to, all things considered. In the receiving game, Phillip Brooks, RJ Garcia are going to be your 1-2. Keegan Johnson, the Iowa transfer, he should be your 3, if not higher, but he's injured. He's questionable, so watch his status. I think he would immediately take over the snaps that like Jaden Jackson played. Benson, no. Awesome tight end. 7 targets, 96 yards. Route share above 70%. He's live at 4,500 too. He might be the best price-adjusted option for Kansas State if you're stacking with Will Howard. Utah BYU, or excuse me, Utah Baylor. Jeez. Trying to do both Utah teams. Utah Baylor. 7.5 point spread, 47 total. The big news here is Cam Rising. Does he play or not? I don't know. He's practicing now, allegedly without any restrictions. That's good. I do think his price is way too high here. I think they still use Nate Johnson as like that wildcat runner, even if Rising plays, just because he offers something different. And their O-line played pretty well against Florida. They'll use him definitely behind that O-line, especially because Jaquindon Jackson's banged up. Only carry the ball 5 times in their opener. We don't have a status on him either. I think he plays, but Micah Bernard might play more. Jalen Glover, like they basically operated in a 3-way committee, which makes them really hard to target. And then route-wise, this team was a disaster. Devon Vele played his normal role, but only saw 3 targets, turned in 14 yards. From there, they basically rotated a bunch of guys. Like Money Parks did have an 81% route share, just 1 target, is doing a bunch of cardio out there. Mikey Matthews, that 4-star freshman, 4 targets, 59% of the routes. There's a chance he just plays more down the stretch here. Micah Pittman, the Florida State transfer, non-factor, only 22% of the routes. Mikey Matthews, the only problem is he's 5,300, which is a concern. Just needs to play more if he's going to be priced at this. Last thing here, Brant Keithy, the tight end. Still no word on him. Thomas Yasmin, 70% of the routes, 4 targets. He's definitely live as a punt at 3,600. My favorite play in the whole offense if Brant Keithy is out. Baylor, Blake Shapen gets injured. They bring Sawyer Robertson in. Didn't have a huge sample. 14 rushing yards, pretty decent, but we still don't have any real clarity on Robertson at this point. He hasn't played at all other than basically a half a game last week. So you could definitely throw a shot here just as an unknown. There's not really anything to break down, but sometimes if Sawyer Robertson balls out, he'll probably never beat this price again. Now, he could also suck and be priced like a Northwestern quarterback. So just consider that tournament play only. In the backfield, I think this is going to be more of a committee going forward. You did see Dominic Richardson out-touch Richard Reese 19-7. Dave Aranda apparently regretted this. It was one of the things he focused on in his post-game press conference, saying they need to get Richard Reese more touches. They've never used him as a pass catcher, and they clearly got down in their last game. So when the going gets tough for Baylor, I still have questions about Richard Reese's role, but I think this gets closer to a 50-50 committee in the near future. For the time being, Dominic Richardson is the better price-adjusted play. 19 touches at 4,300 in a game they lost. That's certainly viable. Receiving game, Keytron Jackson operated as their 1. That was a surprise to me. Then they just rotated their 2 through 4, Hal Presley, Jonah Burton, former walk-on, and Monterey Baldwin. None of them even hit 50% of the routes. You had Josh Cameron in there as well. He did hit 50, but didn't get higher, just 50 on the dot. Beyond Keytron Jackson, I think you go to Drake Dabney, their tight end, 82% of the routes. They ran a lot of 12, like Jake Roberts, Kelsey Johnson played a fair amount here, but Dabney, 9 targets. You could certainly play him at 4K as a one-off. Nebraska, Colorado, the first really interesting game on the slate for DFS, in my opinion. 3-point spread in favor of Colorado. 59 total is healthy. Colorado's playing fast. They're playing pass heavy out of necessity. They had a terrible showing on the ground. Didn't even average 2 yards per carry against TCU. And man, this defense had problems. 7.1 yards per carry to TCU. They allowed more yards per attempt on the ground than they did in the air. That's going to put them in shootouts, and that's going to keep them interesting, and we'll navigate it in a second. Nebraska comes off the Minnesota game, a really slow, run-heavy game, but this puts Jeff Sims firmly in play. This is going to sound crazy when I say it, but please hear me out. Jeff Sims is the best price-adjusted play on the slate, and it's not close. He's 7,200, and he played terribly as a passer. Now, working in his favor, Colorado plays horrible defense. They still don't have Cormani McClain, their 5-star freshman corner. Miles Slusher's out of this game, their nickel. Travis Hunter's playing both ways. I mean, how long can he do that? Regardless, passing doesn't even matter for Jeff Sims. He had 14 designed rush attempts. 14 designed attempts. That doesn't even include him scrambling. We're going to see him run, and he had 91 yards in their first game. He's been mobile with Georgia Tech. His floor is so good here. He's the best price-adjusted play projection-wise, and he has the safest floor. He's your number one cash game quarterback. For tournaments, I think it's pretty easy to get away. You can see the bottom falling out on him. I mean, he had 114 passing yards last week. Tons of turnovers with Jeff Sims. So he's going to be in cash games for a lot of people. For tournaments, I think you can easily get away. The backfield, Gabe Irvin's going to get more carries, allegedly. They're going to run a committee, and it's going to be nasty. You basically have Grant and Irving splitting 2-down work, and then you have Ramir Johnson running as their third down back. Johnson had a 58% route share. Like, he is their third down back without a doubt. Nasty to target. They did lose their target leader, Isaiah Garcia Castaneda. That should basically, I think it's going to give us clear 3 wide receiver sets with Marcus Washington, Alex Bullock, and Billy Kemp. I think Kemp is my favorite. Just he is the most, I guess, proven pedigree at this point, playing with Virginia. But Washington's route should rise, only 46% in their last game. He was hurt all camp, so expect him to come back. A lot of people are going to play Colorado. I think if you want to navigate this and be contrarian, Washington and Bullock and Kemp as a run back is not going to be particularly owned. Tight ends, they didn't really focus their attention on any individual tight end, so that's going to be a pass. Shedeur Sanders, 9,400. I don't like this price. I'm not exactly sold on him as a passer yet. 510 yards against TCU is positive. I mean, that's a good secondary, but he was under pressure a ton. Their offensive line was horrible. He got sacked 5 times, took negative 32 rushing yards. He doesn't run a lot. Like, he never even had the best rushing stats in the FCS. If he takes sacks and he doesn't hit the 300-yard bonus, he's going to bury your lineups at 9,400. He's going to be owned. I like him as a fade personally, but the upside's undeniable. This could easily shoot out. And, I mean, this defense is so bad that I'm worried Shedeur just gets put into shootouts. So, honestly, right now, I'm thinking I'm going to be fading him to some degree, but the fade is scary for sure with this horrific defense on the other side. The backfield, this is really hard to decipher. Dylan Edwards played a lot down the stretch, and he played a lot as a pass catcher, 5 targets for him. But I'm still waiting to see when they unleash Alton McCaskill, the Houston transfer. We don't know. You're not going to know till warm-ups likely. But I do think this is a committee regardless. Even if McCaskill plays, he's not just going to walk into like 26 opportunities or something. Jackson State transfer, Sevion Wilkerson's going to play. Anthony Hankerson's going to be involved. They didn't have Cavassier Smoke last week. When he returns, he'll be involved too. Where people are going to target their exposure is the pass game, again, with Sanders, but also stacking. These guys project well. So at 7K for Hunter, 7.4 for Horn, and 7.2 for Weaver, I can't even knock this. They still project well, and you should be playing them. I do think they are going to be in this order, I guess, owned in this order. Hunter 1, Horn 2, Weaver 3. And I actually like Weaver the most, I think, as far as safety. because he outproduced Jimmy Horn at UCF. We have a big sample of that. And then Hunter, if this game gets out of control, I think he's the guy that sees his snaps decrease because he's going to play both ways in competitive games. So like if Colorado gets up by 14 points or something, maybe they ease off with Hunter at least a little bit. So I don't know. I think Weaver is my favorite for tournaments. But we move on. A game we won't spend a ton of time on. Eastern Kentucky, Kentucky. Don't have the spread for this game yet. Don't have the projections up from SP+. I'm just from now on projecting all FCS, FBS game, unless it's like an FCS national champion. But Eastern Kentucky's not. They got killed by Cincinnati. From now on, I'm projecting these as 38-point spreads and 50 totals. That gives us a pretty good indication where these teams should be. Don't play anyone on Eastern Kentucky. Simple enough. I wouldn't even play Jaden Smith at 4,100. There's better plays. Kentucky. Interesting evaluation. They played Ball State last week. They killed Ball State. Covered on the last play. 39th in seconds per play, but they passed 61.5% of the time in a slaughtering. So Devin Leary's live here, even against an FCS team. I mean, he didn't play well in their last game. Negative rushing yards. He's not mobile. But you could easily see a 300-yard bonus from Leary. I love his receivers. They're still ironing out kinks. It's Leary's first year in Liam Cohn's offense. That was the offense that brought Will Levis, put him on the map. So I'm going to stack this team. Dane Key, Berrien Brown, Tavion Robinson. None of them are particularly expensive. I think you can buy low on Berrien Brown, last year's wide receiver 1. I think you can buy low on Tavion Robinson, the transfer. And Dane Key had the best game, so I'm not even worried about him at 4,700. Ray Davis, even in a slaughtering, still touched the ball 19 times. And this offense might honestly be better for his floor. Only 14 carries, but he had 5 targets and he had a 69% route percentage in a slaughtering. You can play Ray Davis for sure. Play Kentucky guys. They're going to be owned, but I don't think any of them are going to be egregiously owned. Ray Davis, because there's other really good running backs we haven't talked about, like Judkins and some others. And there's really good receiver plays. There's the Colorado guys. There's Burks for Purdue. And there's 3 options for Kentucky, so I think this spreads out their ownership here. I'm going to play these Kentucky guys. Texas A&M, Miami, excellent game. 3.5-point spread. Miami's taking a ton of money. The spread favors Texas A&M. The total's 51. Texas A&M showed out that new offense. They were fast, 26 in seconds per play. Miami was slow. I thought they might play faster. There's a chance they do. Shannon Dawson came right out and said after the game they didn't show anything. We expected that. But he also wasn't fast at Houston, so I have questions here. Anyway, for DFS, this is a decent game. I think there is a little bit of room towards the over, and that's one last thing with, the fragility and projections early on. Miami's defense wasn't tested. They played a MAC team. Texas A&M played New Mexico. There's a chance that these offenses are faster and these defenses are worse. I mean, like Miami had struggles last year in defense. I personally like what they have, but Texas A&M was outside the top 100 in almost every single defensive category. They made improvements, but how high can you jump year over year? So I'm going to play some of this game. I do think you're going to see pretty decent ownership among the receivers, specifically for Texas A&M. Wegman at 9K, I don't see it, but you probably see him throw more in this contest. Did run a little bit, 22 yards. He's more of like a GPP stacking option. I don't think he's going to be particularly owned. I just personally still have questions with this offense. For the running back position, I think Reuben Owens is a buy low right now. Wasn't really that efficient, but highly recruited kid. He played more snaps than the other backs. So David Bailey, I don't anticipate getting any snaps in this game. He basically salted away the game at the end. I think all those go towards Reuben Owens. He's somebody I'll look to in tournaments. And then the receiving game, you basically got your top 3 without much rotation here. Evan Stewart, Noah Thomas, and Aeneas Smith. Moose Muhammad did have a 59% route share. I think a lot of that goes to Stewart, Thomas, and Smith when the going gets tough for this team. You also didn't have Wright, the tight end. He just barely played as they didn't need him. Apparently, he's been banged up. So a lot of these Jake Johnson routes at 44%, I do think they go over to Wright, who played a lot last year. But I do think you want to play some of this team. And I like Smith in particular as a GPP play. He was the wide receiver 1 last year before he got hurt. Miami, Van Dyke doesn't run. He didn't have a single rush attempt, not designed, not scrambling, not sacked. Only threw for 201 yards against a MAC school. Played lackluster is a kind way to put it in that game. $7,900 is a pretty bad price tag on him. Don't love it. Would rather play Sims. The backfield is a three-way committee. I don't think Chaney factors in much in competitive games, but at best it's three-way. At worst it's four-way. If I'm playing any of them, it's probably Mark Fletcher. He's just the four-star highest recruited player for this backfield right now. The receiving game, Jacoby George and Xavier Restrepo, both 81% route shares. They're priced cheaper than Colby Young. And Colby Young played well, but he had a 50% route share in 4 targets. If you're buying low on players, Restrepo and George are the guys I want to get to, just much cheaper price tags than Young. And I think down the road, this floor is going to fall out on Colby Young if he continues with the 50% routes. You can't be splitting time with like Isaiah Horton. Last thing here, I do think they use tight ends more. They didn't have Jaleel Skinner last week. They didn't have Arroyo. We'll see if they return, but that could also siphon away some routes from these ancillary receivers like Harrell and Brashard Smith and whatnot. Iowa State, 36.5 total. 4-point spread in favor of the Hawkeyes. They still looked bad last week, even though they played Utah State. They punted 7 times, which is egregious. McNamara's hurt, and he's hurt pretty bad. It's a lower body injury, a quad injury. He can't run. I don't know why Ferentz said this, but he basically came right out and said, yeah, we don't have bootlegs or sneaks, really any quarterback runs in the playbook right now. I mean, thanks for telling us, but I wasn't going to play McNamara anyway. The backfield, Caleb Johnson, 19 carries. He did not see a target, but they kind of split work in the past game. He'll see targets occasionally. I do think you can use him. Iowa State played Northern Iowa, so they were entirely untested. If you're looking for, a potential efficiency spot behind a good offensive line, they return 4 guys, pass block and run blocks well. Caleb Johnson, somebody I do like here. Receiving game is a disaster. I was very disappointed to see them take their foot off the gas with the Reganey and Caleb Brown. I don't know why you're using guys like Seth Anderson as an 80% route share guy when Caleb Brown's at 35%, Reganey's at 44%. I'm probably just playing tight ends or passing here. Lachey, still 4K, 91% of routes. That's fine. 9 targets. You can play Lachey. Eric All, I don't hate either. 65% of routes, 4 targets, caught the touchdown. That's where I'm looking if I'm playing an Iowa guy. It's the tight ends or Caleb Johnson. Iowa State still projects to use 2 quarterbacks. Stay away. Cartevius Norton maybe plays more in more competitive games, but they did use Abu Sama a fair amount, and I'm not sure how much he sees down the road. It's pretty tough to play an Iowa State back. The only thing that keeps him in play is that price tag on Norton. It's going to be bigger GPPs, but I'm not Xing him out. Receiving game surprised me. Easton Dean did not play a lot at tight end. I tried to find if this was an injury or something. If you have the info, please let me know in the comments. But they basically rotated tight ends 4 ways. That's enough to have me stay away from Easton Dean. Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins were the top 2 receivers. Just no efficiency here. So I'm not playing any Iowa pass catchers. But whatever happened to Dean, would still like to know. Ole Miss Tulane, maybe the marquee game on this slate. It's probably this game or the A&M Miami game. But for DFS, man, 66.5 total, 7-point spread in favor of Ole Miss, coming off a beatdown of Mercer. And Tulane looked really good against South Alabama, a game that was projected pretty close, but not that 20-point win for Tulane. On the Ole Miss side, Jackson Dart played awesome, but he played Mercer. He did struggle against elevated competition last year, so this is something to watch. He's mobile, really mobile, 36 rush yards, over 300 pass yards in just 23 attempts. I think we see Sanders at points in this game, so I still have concerns with Dart, especially now that he's 9,700. Upside's undeniable. This is the premier shootout of the week, so I'm not going to fade Dart entirely, but he's not a guy I'm going to just absolutely unload the clip on. Quinshon Judkins is that guy, though. 15 touches against Mercer. 6 yards. I mean, he didn't box score or anything, but we know what Judkins can do. This is an absolutely awesome player. We want to be playing him. Behind him, I think Bentley's probably your main change of pace back. He's a little expensive at this price tag. Receiving game, Zachary Franklin does not project to play here. Caden Prieskorn does not project to play here. And we have Hudson Wolf injured at tight end as well, potentially narrowing routes and snaps. Trey Harris, 9 targets. He only participated in 49% of the routes, had the 4 scores. His route share is going to go up in more competitive games, so don't worry about that. We have him projected for a normal route share. He had an excellent game. But we also had Jordan Watkins with an excellent game. Trey Harris, 133 yards on 9 targets. Jordan Watkins had 111 on 6. You just had Trey Harris with the 4 scores. So now you see this massive gap in price. But Jordan Watkins, not really that different. He played a lot more than Harris, too. So I think you could just buy low on Watkins, honestly. But I don't want to slight Harris by any means. He had an awesome game. The wide receiver 3 is Dayton Wade. 3 targets, 23 yards, nothing impressive. I do think you see this mixed and matched between like Aiden Williams. I don't know. Some of the Jalen Knox, like he played 30% of the routes. But tight end is someplace I think you can get interesting. You basically had this split 50-50 between Michael Trigg and Kyron Heath. I like the price on both these guys. For darts on this Ole Miss team below 4K, Trigg's an elite receiving option. He had 5 targets, and Heath came in with 3. Both of them were right around 50 yards receiving, so you could definitely play them. Michael Pratt continued his awesome efficiency against South Alabama. They'll definitely pass more than 29.5%. Plays per game and seconds per play, I'm not sure, rises a ton. They weren't the fastest team last year, but Pratt's hyper efficient. Did miss some practice time this week. I think he plays. I don't think he's really limited, but he's mobile. He's efficient as a passer. He's in the game environment that you want. Ole Miss is going to score on you, pace you up. So Pratt's fine. I think outside of Sims, Pratt's probably your second cash quarterback. With that's going to come ownership, so navigate it carefully. Again, I like some of the pivots in the range. Armstrong, I think, is okay. Hartman, I think, is fine. There's a couple other guys we'll talk about here, but Pratt, I think he's probably the most owned quarterback in this range. Full-blown running back by committee. I went back and I looked at the box score to see when these guys handled opportunities. They split the whole game. So Lewis, Hughes, Clayton Johnson, Celestine, all of them are GPP plays. Receiving game was really clear, shockingly. It was Lawrence Keys, Chris Brazzell II, Jaquan Jackson, and then Alex Bauman, their tight end. Basically, all of them above at least 72% of the routes. And Brazzell, 77% of the routes. That was higher than Jaquan Jackson at 72%. I think Keys and Jackson are still good price-adjusted values, but man, Brazzell at 4,100, playing a full-time role, he's just way too cheap. Moving to UTEP Northwestern, real barn burner we got here. UTEP is favored on the road, 1.5 points. Over Northwestern, a total of 39.5. I might have to bet Northwestern. UTEP is atrocious, but there's a DraftKings only game. Gavin Hardison, the UTEP signal caller, is not really mobile. Maybe this is just a bias after betting them in week 0. I have no faith in this coaching staff putting their players in position to win. But Gavin Hardison is averaging over 300 yards. Excuse me, he's 300 passing yards this year. I thought that was his average for a second. He's averaging 151. That's pitiful. And he doesn't run much. So this is going to be an issue for Hardison. He's too expensive. Dan Hankins still in a 3-way committee with Torrance Burgess and Mike Franklin. They need to axe this committee, but I don't think they're going to. So this is a bit tough for me at 6K. Other players I'd rather get to. Tyron Smith averaging 6 targets per game. Kelly Akari averaging 4.5. They're both priced egregiously high for this kind of workload. It'll be a full pass on UTEP. Northwestern, Ben Bryant, I think, plays this full game here, even though we saw Sullivan last week. They just got slaughtered by Rutgers. They also had to abandon the run entirely. They still played fast. They were 7th in seconds per play, so I don't want to just completely forget Cam Porter. For tournaments, you could throw a dart here. But the receiving game is interesting. The one thing I'll say is they didn't have Bryce Kurtz. So if he returns, I do think Cam Johnson and Jacob Gill are affected more than anyone else. AJ Henning plays in the slot, and Kurtz is a perimeter receiver along with Johnson and Gill. So those would be the guys I think get affected more. Henning also just like probably the best player on this offense, a Michigan transfer. He led the team in yards. I'd play Henning out of any of the pass catchers, to be honest. Tight end, I expect to rotate. 2 games left. UNLV, Michigan, 37-point spread in favor of Michigan. 57 total. Michigan still passed 50% of the time despite slaughtering East Carolina last week. And I don't know what they do here. They probably just play slow, and I do think they go run heavier at some point. But this is another flaw in the projections, or potential flaw, or I guess I should say unknown. Do they retain this 50% pass rate in blowouts, or do they go back to running the ball more? Because it's going to significantly influence how much you get of Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson versus getting more Donovan Edwards and Blake Corum. So just know that going in. UNLV projects terribly. None of them are good plays. Brumfeld, I love. I can't wait till he actually gets in conference play, but in these tough matchups, he's a complete stay away. Ricky White is same thing. I mean, he's a Michigan State transfer. I like him. I like him a lot. But in these games, they're just not priced at a place where you can play them outside of maybe a run back. Seneca McKee and Jacob DeJesus, I expect to be the 3 wide receivers in this in this receiving core. Backfield was a 3-way committee, no interest there. For Michigan, again, you want to play Michigan guys. It's just a matter of how do you think this game plays out? If you think they run more, which I thought was going to be the case last week, but again, that 50% pass rate has me wary. But if you do think they run more, play the backs. If you think they pass a decent amount, get to Wilson and Johnson and Loveland. But whoever you think sees more work is going to project well. J.J. McCarthy is also more mobile than -2 yards. I just don't think they need to use it. He projects well if you give him all the snaps. We're going to dock him some. We saw that last week. Davis Warren played. Edwards and Corum are always going to project well in these games. Edwards outtouched Corum 16-3, and he's cheaper, 6,800 versus 8,400. Corum's coming off the big injury, so they're easing him in a little bit. I'd rather play Edwards straight up. And then Wilson, Johnson, Loveland, these are all rotational guys, I think, for lineups. Nobody I really want to plant my flag on because of the volatility in a 37-point spread, but guys you can play because of the upside. They have a monstrous team total. They're going to score on this team. You need pieces for tournaments. Last game, and boy, did we save a good one for last. Marshall, ECU, 3-point spread in favor of Marshall, 43.5 total. DraftKings asleep at the wheel, left Rasheen Ali at 4,800. He had 19 touches, 18 of those were carries, over 100 yards rushing. Don't be worried about the pass game role. He only saw 1 target, but he participated in 72% of the routes, the available routes. Rasheen Ali is the best play in the slate. I think you can get to Cam Fancher as a potential GPP play. I don't think he's good, but he did pass for 268 yards against an FCS team. He runs a little bit. So as far as tournaments go, everyone's priced up. You might be able to gain an edge just by playing a cheap quarterback, and Fancher should be in your pool along with McLeod and some of those other scrubs. Card. I would rank Card ahead of Fancher. Receiving game, I don't really want to stack Fancher because he's more mobile and I think he has passing concerns. And interestingly, Cade Conley played the most in terms of routes, 86%. He's their tight end. They rotated receivers, nasty rotation here. Nobody above 53%. So Chuck Montgomery, 7 targets, but 53% route rate. DeMarcus Harris, 6 targets, 47% route rate. There's concerns here. ECU, they split quarterbacks. They're going to split quarterbacks again. They split running backs. They're going to split running backs again. A ton of their receivers are hurt, so they're using Jarek Gardner and Jalen Johnson as the main guys. Josiah Hatfield had the biggest route share, but ultimately that didn't amount to many targets. 3 overall. Sorry, dogs barking in the background. Nothing I can do about it. But that'll do it for us. Perfect time to sign off. If you have any questions, leave a comment. Follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. Hit the thumbs up button on the way out. That helps a ton. Otherwise, we'll be back again next week. We'll see you later.